Okay.
Hello, I'm representing an MSA 7th grade NHD group, and this is Dr. Geertz. You want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Chris Garretts. I'm professor of history at Bethel University.
Okay, let's get going with the questions.
Mhm.
So, how did Jackie make a difference as a civil rights activist?
Sure. So I think if we know anything about Jackie Robinson, we think about him as a baseball player, and just the fact that he played baseball was hugely important for civil rights. So he starts his major league career in 1947. Coming out of World War II, there's a lot of energy behind civil rights reform.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just as a symbol of a black man succeeding in a white man's sport, it was an important milestone for the civil rights movement. And his career continues for 10, 11 years. He's a Hall of Fame baseball player. But I think what most people don't know is what happened after his career. So, first of all, he actually works for a coffee company. He's involved in black owned banks, I think on the East Coast. Might be wrong about that. But part of what he wants to show is how then African Americans can succeed in the business world, how they can break into other kinds of careers, so in a sense, break other color lines. And then, maybe most importantly, he's actively involved in the civil rights movement. So, for example, I think it's 1962, there was a banquet in New York to honor Jackie Robinson because he was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And it was a fundraiser for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the guest speaker was Martin Luther King Jr., and then Jackie Robinson gave a response, and then the proceeds went to benefit the civil rights movement. So he used his celebrity to raise money for the movement, but he also marched. He was on picket lines, and he carried posters, and he was active in politics. What's kind of interesting is in 1960, Jackie Robinson actually decided to support Richard Nixon in the presidential race against John Kennedy. And his argument was that it was important that African Americans not be tied too closely to one political party. And he was very close to Nelson Rockefeller, who was the liberal Republican governor of New York. But by the end of the 1960s, Robinson was pretty disillusioned with the Republican Party and started supporting Democrats instead. I think the last thing I would say is by the end of his life, Jackie Robinson was fairly bitter about what it was like to be a black man in America. So if you ever look up his autobiography, it came out right about the same time he died in 1972, when he was still a pretty young man. And it's called I Never Had It Made. And he explains at the beginning of the book what he means by that. So he remembers being at his first World Series as a young player. And he talks about the pageantry and the national anthem and the flag waving and the excitement of the moment. And he says at the same time he felt like he didn't quite belong. And he looks back at it and he says, I was really just kind of an actor. It was really Branch Rickey's show. And then he says, all these years later, I can't salute the flag and I can't stand at the national anthem because I'm a black man in a white man's world. And he said no matter if it's 1972 or 1947, when he was born in 1919, I never had it made. Like the odds were always against me. And so it's kind of a sad way to end because it's such an inspiring story, but as his life went along, he was very frustrated by the lack of progress. And so that's how he starts that book.
Yeah. So, can you explain, tying with this, what did Jackie leave behind after he passed?
Yeah, I think most importantly, he leaves the legacy of being a pioneer. It's hard to be the first person to do anything, and especially to be the first person when people send you hate mail and threaten to kill you, and players spike you and don't talk to you or insult you. And to do that with dignity and grace and to succeed like that by itself as an athlete was the most important legacy, to show that a black man could play the national pastime with white players. We live in an age when there's so many different sports, and baseball is just one of them. I don't think we realize how important baseball was in 1947. I mean, it's very clearly the national pastime that millions of people play. It's a symbol of America. In some ways, it's kind of, it's America's stage in some ways, where we show like what Americans are capable of. And so it was a hugely important moment to show that an African American could participate there. Now, the flip side of that, that's a little bit more complicated, is what it really meant was the death of the Negro Leagues. That's part of the legacy, too. So African Americans have been playing baseball as long as white Americans had. It goes back to the Civil War. And you start getting teams around 1900, 1910, and then around 1920, a former pitcher named Rube Foster owns a team, and he manages to form the first Negro League. And so there are a series of leagues, but it's a really important institution because it was meant to really compete with the major leagues and to say, well, if you won't let us play, we'll make our own leagues with our own stadiums, our own umpires, our own statisticians, our own journalists, and we will do baseball as well as you can. And then in the off season, white teams would play black teams, and by some estimates, the African American teams won about 75% of the games against the white teams. And so there's this really proud tradition of the Negro Leagues that's a symbol, but by the 50s, I mean, it's not enough to have a separate but equal thing. We want to be integrated. And so Jackie Robinson symbolizes that, but by the end of the 1950s, the Negro Leagues are gone. So Hank Aaron is one of the last Negro League players. He plays when he's a young player, and then he goes to play with the Braves. And that's kind of the last gasp of the Negro Leagues. So that's kind of the complicated legacy. Like, it's worth it, right, to integrate baseball, and then other sports get integrated too, but the Negro Leagues are lost in the process.
Yeah. So getting into how he started doing all of these things and all the achievements that he's done, how did Branch even find out about Jackie, and why did he even decide to give him a chance?
Yeah, so there are a lot of things happening. So first of all, there had been a couple of black players in the 19th century, and then there's kind of an informal agreement among owners and managers not to hire black athletes in baseball. And the commissioner of baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, supported that really strongly. But he died in 1944, and the new commissioner had been watching World War II. Right, it's the middle of the 40s. He said, "We've got African Americans dying on battlefields in the Pacific and Europe. Why?" And he kind of thinks aloud and says, "Maybe there's no reason they can't play baseball." So that's the first thing. The second thing is that in New York City, there was a push to actually end discrimination in hiring. So there was a city ordinance passed. The mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, was investigating, and he threatened to kind of take on baseball because New York had three major league teams, the Yankees, Giants, and Dodgers at that point. And the final thing that happened is the Dodgers had a new ownership, and so Branch Rickey was not only the general manager, but he owned a quarter of the team. And for a lot of reasons, Branch Rickey had been looking to recruit black players. And he convinced the Dodgers that this would be a way to get the Dodgers to the pennant. The Dodgers had always been kind of a hapless team. They got to the World Series a couple of times, but they're always kind of their dumb bums, is what they called them. So Branch Rickey had this great tradition with the Cardinals. He had built the farm system, and so he was brought in to take them to the World Series. And he said, "Well, I need better players," and so he decided, "I'm going to start scouting black athletes." And so he hires scouts, these kind of seasoned baseball, former coaches, players, managers, sends them around. Some of them go to Puerto Rico, to Cuba, but mostly they go to the Negro Leagues. And they start scouting the Negro Leagues, not just for a good young player, but also someone who can be a role model. And they land on Jackie Robinson. So Jackie Robinson at that point was playing infield for the Kansas City Monarchs, who were one of the greatest Negro League teams, the team Satchel Paige pitched for. He was fresh out of the Army. So Jackie Robinson was a four-star athlete at UCLA, a college graduate, very well spoken, already kind of nationally known in some ways. He had been in the Army. So he was going to play semi-pro football, but Pearl Harbor happened, and so he signed up, and he became an officer. And a month after D-Day, in July of 1944, he was getting on a bus at Army base, and the bus driver told him to go to the back of the bus, and he refused. And he ended up being arrested by military police, and he asked for a court-martial, and he was acquitted. And he was honorably discharged from the military. And so all of that together, he was a great baseball player, a gifted athlete, a college graduate, an Army veteran, someone who had kind of been through this and come out with his dignity intact, made him very appealing, and Rickey's scouts told him about Jackie Robinson. And so they brought Jackie Robinson to Ebbets Field, and they had a famous 3-hour meeting with Rickey, and Rickey essentially tried to provoke him. He played this role of a hotel owner who won't let Robinson stay at the hotel, or someone swearing at him from the other bench. And Robinson kind of held up, and Rickey said, "Well, for a year you can't fight back, right? And are you strong enough not to get angry and to withstand this and to show what you're capable of?" It turned out after that year, Jackie Robinson was actually a very angry baseball player. He got in fights with umpires and other players all the time. But for that first year, he just kept his head down and won the Rookie of the Year and showed that he could help to lead the Dodgers to the World Series. And they ended up winning several championships, won the World Series once while Robinson was playing with them.
Yeah. So he was this successful of a baseball player, and he even got into the Hall of Fame.
Mhm.
What made him get out of baseball?
Yeah, he was pretty young. I think late 30s or so. He probably could have played for another couple of years. He was actually traded to the Giants right as he retired and never played for them. So most likely what happened is Jackie Robinson suffered from diabetes, and he was starting to feel the physical effects, and he just didn't feel like he could keep playing at the same level that he was playing, and he had business interests, and he wanted to be active in the civil rights movement, and so he decided to retire early. And then 5 years later, he was elected to the Hall of Fame.
May you explain how Jackie playing in the major leagues helped other athletes subjected to racism join the major leagues or any other sports leagues?
Yeah, so he's the first, but within a couple of years, many teams in the American League and National League start hiring Negro League players. Larry Doby is the first American League black player. And, again, the Negro Leagues go away within 10 years. Baseball in the 1950s has lots of black stars like Willie Mays and Hank Aaron. Frank Robinson comes along in the 1960s. He's later the first black manager in the 70s. He just died this year. And then other sports follow suit. So the National Basketball Association is just coming together at this time. It starts hiring black players. The National Hockey League, it's not till the late 50s that the first Afro-Canadian player, Willie O'Ree, plays. So that takes a lot longer in that sport. Football is a little different. So the NFL had actually integrated a year before Jackie Robinson. So the NFL had actually had black players up until in its early days in the 20s. And then in 1946, both the LA Rams and the Cleveland Browns both signed a couple of black athletes. So in a sense, they actually had come before Jackie Robinson, but baseball was so much a bigger sport than football at that point that Jackie Robinson was the much bigger deal.
Oh, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Dr. Gertz.
Sure, thanks for talking to me.